All right, let's dive into the world of antibiotics. Not just like, oh, I have an ear infection, take a pill, but like, how do these things actually work?
Yeah, it's a whole microscopic battle going on.
Right. We have Dr. Ked Hassan's lecture to guide us. He's a pharmacology whiz. So where do we even begin with antibiotics?
Well, you understand, these little molecules are super complex, like each one's got its own special move and its own target.
True, it can feel overwhelming, right? Like, where do you even start?
Well, Dr. Hassan breaks it down in two ways. First, by their chemical structure, like their family tree, and then by how they actually attack the bacteria.
Ah, so like their battle strategy.
Exactly. And knowing these families helps doctors pick the right antibiotic for the job. Like, you wouldn't use a hammer for everything, right?
Makes sense. So no wrenches for everything.
Yeah.
Speaking of families, Dr. Hassan mentions 6 main ones: penicillin, cephalosporin, tetracycline, aminoglycoside, macrolide, and then this others group.
Oh, yeah, the others, it's like the miscellaneous drawer of antibiotics with things like fluoroquinolones.
Right, so some families are like huge and famous. The penicillins, everyone knows them.
Yeah, those were some of the first discovered, totally changed medicine. But others are smaller, more specialized, like aminoglycosides. Those are usually for the more serious infections.
So once we've got these families figured out, then how do they actually fight bacteria?
All right, this is where it gets really cool. Dr. Hassan outlines 4 main battle strategies. Some antibiotics, the cell wall inhibitors, they go straight for the bacteria's cell wall.
Like breaking down their defenses.
Exactly. Imagine a castle with its walls crumbling. That bacteria is not going to last long.
Wow, that's a powerful image. Are the other strategies just as direct?
Some are more subtle.
Right.
There are the protein synthesis inhibitors. They stop bacteria from making protein.
Essential for survival, right?
Totally. It's like cutting off their food supply. Then you've got the even sneakier ones, the nucleic acid synthesis inhibitors. They go after the bacteria DNA and RNA.
So they can't replicate or spread?
Nope. Like scrambling their blueprints, they can't build or reproduce.
So we've got their walls, their food, their blueprints, anything else?
You bet. Some mess with the bacteria's metabolism. Remember that folic acid trick we mentioned?
Oh, yeah, that was wild.
Right. So these guys disrupt the bacteria's ability to make essential nutrients, basically mess up their vitamin supply chain.
Wow, so we've got antibiotics targeting their walls, their food, their blueprints, and even their vitamins. So many different ways to attack.
Right. It's like a whole arsenal of tiny weapons. Which strategy seems most effective to you?
Ooh, that's a tough one. They all seem pretty important. It's like you wouldn't want to just choose one weapon to fight a war.
Exactly. Each strategy has its pros and cons. Choosing the right antibiotic really depends on the specific bacteria causing the infection.
It's getting complex now. So we've got families and battle strategies, but where does all this play out inside a bacterial cell?
Okay, so Dr. Hassan actually uses a visual aid here, a diagram of a bacterial cell.
So it's like a battle map.
Yeah, it shows all the key spots where different antibiotics can launch their attack.
Identifying the bacteria's weak points. What are some of those key targets?
Well, you've got the cell wall, obviously. Then there are the ribosomes. Those are responsible for making proteins. And then the DNA and RNA, where those sneaky nucleic acid synthesis inhibitors come into play.
I feel like I'm learning how to be a microscopic general. Okay, now Dr. Hassan focuses on one group called beta-lactams. They're the big guns for cell wall inhibitors.
Exactly, the heavy hitters. Beta-lactams are super important because they're effective against a huge range of bacteria. This family includes the penicillins, the cephalosporins, carbapenems, and monobactams.
Wow, it's like a whole family reunion.
Right. But there's a challenge with beta-lactams, something called antibiotic resistance. Some bacteria have evolved ways to fight back.
Like they're learning our strategies.
Basically, they can produce enzymes called beta-lactamases that actually destroy beta-lactam antibiotics.
Oh, so they're developing countermeasures. That sounds a bit scary.
It's definitely a concern, but scientists have come up with a clever solution: beta-lactamase inhibitors.
What are those? Like antibiotic shields?
Exactly. They protect the beta-lactams from being destroyed. They're often combined with beta-lactam antibiotics to make them more effective.
So it's like a tag team effort. Science always finding ways to adapt. It's impressive.
For sure. There's this constant back and forth, a real arms race between us and the bacteria.
So much going on at the microscopic level.
You have no idea.
Well,
but for now, let's recap what we've covered about antibiotics.
okay, so we started with classifying antibiotics by their families and by their methods of attack, their mechanisms of action. We also talked about those 4 main battle strategies: attacking the cell wall, inhibiting protein synthesis, disrupting nucleic acid synthesis, and messing with bacterial metabolism.
Right, and we looked at some specific families like the beta-lactams, how they have their strengths, and how bacteria are fighting back with resistance mechanisms.
It's like a constant arms race. But for now, I think we've covered a good amount of ground.
Definitely. We've laid a solid foundation for understanding how complex these little antibiotics really are.
So last time we were talking about those beta-lactams and how some bacteria are, like, becoming resistant to them.
Yeah, it's a problem. But remember those beta-lactamase inhibitors? Those are helping.
Right, the antibiotic bodyguards. But what about those other families? Do they all have their own specialties too?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like a whole team of superheroes, each with their own unique power,
Okay, I like that analogy.
So take cephalosporins, for example.
They're beta-lactams too, right?
Yep, same family, still targeting that cell wall. But get this. There are 5 generations of cephalosporins.
5 generations? What, like a whole antibiotic dynasty?
Kinda. Each generation is effective against a slightly different range of bacteria, and as you go through the generations, they get better at fighting those tough gram-negative bacteria.
Yeah, gram-negative. Those were the ones with the extra layer of defense, right?
You got it. That extra outer layer makes them tough to penetrate.
So the later generations of cephalosporins, they've, like, leveled up their powers.
Exactly. They've evolved to overcome that extra layer of defense.
It's like an arms race at the microscopic level. What about those other families like the tetracyclines, aminoglycosides, and macrolides? What are their strengths?
Those guys, they're all about disrupting protein synthesis.
Right. Stopping the bacteria from making the proteins they need to survive.
Yep. They target those ribosomes, the little protein factories inside the bacterial cell.
Ah, so they're, like, sabotaging the production line. Do they all target the ribosomes in the same way, though?
Actually, that's where it gets even more interesting. So bacterial ribosomes have these 2 subunits, right?
Okay, 2 parts to the machine.
Right. Some antibiotics, like aminoglycosides and tetracyclines, they target one subunit, while macrolides target the other.
So it's like having different tools for different parts of the machinery.
Exactly. And targeting different subunits can affect how effective the antibiotic is, and it can also change the potential side effects.
So it's not just about picking a family, it's about picking the right member of that family, too.
Absolutely. It's a balancing act.
So much to consider. Okay, what about those fluoroquinolones? Those were in the others group, right?
Yep, those are some interesting ones. They target the bacteria's DNA and RNA.
Ah, the ones that stop them from replicating and spreading, those sneaky genetic saboteurs. How do they actually do that?
Okay, so it's pretty complex, but basically, fluoroquinolones block certain enzymes that bacteria need to deal with their DNA.
Like to manage and organize it.
Exactly. And without those enzymes, their DNA can't replicate properly, can't repair itself.
And then, boom, they can't survive.
It can be really effective, but there's a catch, as always.
Side effects.
You know it. Fluoroquinolones can have some pretty serious side effects, so doctors usually save them for more severe infections.
Makes sense, like don't use a sledgehammer when a regular hammer will do.
Right. It's all about weighing the benefits and the risks.
Okay, so we've got families that attack cell walls, protein synthesis, DNA replication. Dr. Hassan also mentioned some that work by messing with the bacteria's metabolism, right? Those ones intrigue me.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about drugs like trimethoprim and sulfonamides.
Those names.
I know, right? But they're super clever. They exploit a key difference between bacteria and human cells.
What's the difference?
Bacteria, they have to make their own folic acid.
Folic acid, that's important for them, right?
Absolutely. They need it for DNA synthesis and other stuff. But humans, we get folic acid from our diet.
So these antibiotics target something that's crucial for bacteria, but not for us.
You got it. Trimethoprim and sulfonamides block different steps in that pathway, so the bacteria basically gets starved of a vital nutrient.
It's like cutting off their supply chain. It's a bit like how some antibiotics target the bacterial cell wall, right? Like Dr. Hassan mentions one called phosphomycin.
Oh yeah, phosphomycin, that one's a good example. It blocks the very early steps of cell wall formation.
So many ways to attack. It's really impressive how diverse these mechanisms of action are.
It is, isn't it? And we've only just scratched the surface. There are so many more specialized antibiotics out there.
I'm definitely feeling a little overwhelmed with all this information, but in a good way.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. But it just shows how amazing and complex these antibiotics really are. And the scientists who discover them, they're geniuses.
Okay, so where do we go from here? We've covered families, strategies, mechanisms. What's next in our antibiotic adventure?
Well, we've talked about the different families and their strategies, but there's this one other really important thing about antibiotics. It affects how we actually choose and use them effectively.
Ooh, sounds mysterious.
It's called antibiotic spectrum. Think of it like this. Each antibiotic has a certain range of bacteria that it can actually target. Some are specialists and some are more like generalists.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. All right, so before we went to, well, I guess we didn't really go anywhere, but before we moved on, you were saying there's this thing, antibiotic spectrum, that affects how we use antibiotics.
Right. So think of it like each antibiotic has like its own hit list.
Right.
It's only going to work against certain bacteria.
So like some antibiotics are specialists, right? They only go after a few specific types of bacteria, while others are more like generalists.
Exactly. Some have a narrow spectrum, so they only target a small group. And then others have a broad spectrum, so they're effective against a whole bunch of different bacteria.
Okay, that makes sense. So like how does a doctor decide which one to use? When would they go for a narrow spectrum versus a broad spectrum?
Well, if you know exactly which bacteria is causing the infection, a narrow-spectrum antibiotic is usually the way to go.
Why is that? Wouldn't it be safer to just use a broad spectrum one just in case?
Well, using a broad-spectrum antibiotic when you don't really need to can actually make that whole antibiotic resistance problem even worse.
Ah, right, because you're killing off all the bacteria, even the good ones.
Exactly. And that gives the resistant bacteria a chance to, take over.
So it's like we need to be precise with our antibiotic use. Like only use the ones that target the specific bacteria causing the problem.
Exactly. It's kind of like weeding a garden, right? You want to pull out the specific weeds you don't want without harming the rest of the plants. And same goes for our bodies. We want to protect our microbiome.
The microbiome, that's the all the good bacteria that live in and on us, right?
Right. It's super important for our health. So yeah, using narrow-spectrum antibiotics helps protect that.
So being strategic with our antibiotics is important. But what if you don't know which bacteria is causing the infection? Like, what happens then?
Well, in those cases, the doctor might start with a broad-spectrum antibiotic, especially if it's a serious infection.
So it's like calling in the big guns first, just in case.
Kind of. And then once they can figure out exactly what bacteria is causing the trouble, they can switch to something more targeted.
Makes sense. It's really fascinating how much strategy goes into choosing the right antibiotic. Makes you realize how important it is to, not pressure doctors for antibiotics when they might not be necessary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Antibiotic resistance is a huge problem, and we all need to do our part to prevent it. So that means only using antibiotics when we really need them and taking them exactly as directed by a healthcare professional.
So no more self-medicating with those leftover pills from last time.
Exactly. And it's also super important to finish the entire course of antibiotics, even if you start feeling better before you've taken all the pills.
Why is that? If you feel better, doesn't that mean the infection's gone?
Well, not necessarily. Stopping early could let some of those bacteria survive, and then they could come back even stronger.
So you got to make sure you wipe them all out, even if it seems like they're gone.
Right. It's about making sure the job is done.
Okay, that makes sense. So besides using antibiotics responsibly, is there anything else we can do to help fight this whole antibiotic resistance thing?
Oh, absolutely. Practicing good hygiene, the basics like washing our hands, covering our coughs and sneezes, all that stuff helps prevent infections in the first place.
Right, the classic advice, but it really does make a difference.
For sure. And then, supporting research into new antibiotics, new ways to fight bacteria, that's super important too.
Like investing in the future of our microscopic defenses. It's amazing to think that all this is happening inside of us all the time. This whole world of bacteria and antibiotics battling it out.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. This deep dive has really given us a new perspective on antibiotics, how they work, and how we can use them responsibly to keep them working for us in the future.
It definitely has. I feel like I learned a ton.
Me too. It's always exciting to dive into this kind of stuff.
Well, thanks for guiding us through it. And thanks to everyone for listening to our deep dive into the fascinating world of antibiotics. Until next time, stay curious and stay healthy.